Explicit versus implicit memories. Explicit memories must be consciously recalled, e.g., who's the Prime Minister of Australia? Well, I've just asked you that question, so you've got to consciously retrieve that from your LTM, put it in your working memory, and then you'll tell me that it's Tony Abbott. An implicit memory, well, it's recalled without conscious effort. You're driving along, you see a red light, you don't need to consciously think about what your right leg needs to do in order to stop that car. Declarative memories must be consciously recalled, i.e. they're explicit. And they're made up of semantic and episodic memories. So semantic memories, that's shared factual knowledge about the external world, e.g. what year is it, who won the footy grand final last week, who's the PM of Australia, etc. Your episodic stuff, well, that's autobiographical. It's personal, it relates to time and place, dealing with your internal world. Levels of processing. Starting with shallow processing, where we only attend to structural features. So we've got a list of words and we simply note which ones start with uppercase or lowercase or maybe a vowel or a consonant, and that leads to a very inefficient encoding, and therefore we're going to have more difficulty with retrieval of that information. Intermediate or phonemic encoding is where we process information according to sound, whether we do that vocally or subvocally. So we might get a list of words and we create rhymes for them. So we've got fish, it rhymes with wish, obviously. And then we've got deep or semantic encoding, where we encode information according to its meaning. And the reason why this is the most effective means of encoding information is because we're using elaborative rehearsal. We're actually linking that information with the existing material that's already in our LTM, so we're literally enhancing the organisation of it, and that leads to a more efficient and effective retrieval when we need that information. Working memory. In terms of the four components, I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown on what you need to know. So the phonological loop, it's got a dual role in speech. The phonological store enables us to briefly hold on to the sounds that we hear so that we can make sense of the speech that other people are delivering to us. And as I'm doing right now, my articulatory control is literally rehearsing the words that I'm about to speak so that my speech flows and I don't need to pause in order to literally get the word ready, and literally I can maintain a sense of speech continuity. The visuospatial sketchpad enables us to use our mind's eye so we can literally mentally navigate our way through a building, but it also keeps tabs on objects in our immediate environment, so we're sitting at a desk and we don't need to keep updating our memory of where our pens and pencils are. Likewise, when you're driving, you'll have a mental representation of your dash, where your wipers are, where your indicators are, etc. The episodic buffer retrieves information and also integrates information from the slave systems and the LTM. But the key point here is it doesn't manipulate it. That's done by the central exec. So the episodic buffer literally can hold on to information from these other systems, and then we can use that and create a chronological or a sequential story as directed by the central executive. So the central executive, as the name implies, controls our attention, and rather than just integrating and accessing the information like the episodic buffer, it actually manipulates the information so that we can perform calculations and make decisions, etc. Other key functions, it filters or suppresses irrelevant information from our mind so we can just focus on the task at hand, enables us to plan, decide, evaluate, rate, etc. The forgetting curve, well, key thing you need to identify here is that it does two things. It measures the rate and amount of forgetting that occurs over time. So for standard material, we're going to lose about half of it after an hour, about 70% after a day, and about 80% after a month. Factors affecting the rate of forgetting. Well, the key thing here is that the shape of the curve never changes. It's always initially going to be quite rapid if you look at the slope of the graph. And then after an hour it's going to slow down to a moderate rate of decline, and then after a few hours a moderate rate of decline. But if we encode the information in a meaningful way using elaborative rehearsal, we're going to retain overall more information, but we're still going to have initially a rapid rate of decline, then moderate, then minor, but it's just the whole curve is going to shift up. Interference. First thing we need to be mindful of is the causes of interference. So when we learn similar information, e.g., let's say we have methods and further back to back, or maybe two sciences like your psych and your bio back to back, particularly when we learn big slabs of information close together in time, thus making it difficult for the hippocampus to consolidate that content. Difference between proactive and retroactive interference. Well, proactive, pro meaning forwards, is when the previously learnt material reduces the learning of the newly learned material, particularly like I said before when it's similar and we do it close in time. That enhances or increases interference. Retro interference, retro meaning backwards, so the newly learned material reduces the retrieval of the previously learnt material. Motivated forgetting. Key thing here is that it's a defense mechanism, and the key word you need to use here is blocking. Blocking traumatic experiences from our conscious awareness in order to literally help us move on, enhance our well-being, etc. So, probably aware of this, but suppression is a conscious process. We consciously try and block these unpleasant experiences from our awareness, whereas repression is an unconscious process, as evidenced through hypnosis and dream analysis, etc. Retrieval failure can be defined as the inability to retrieve information because of the absence of the right cue. We know it, but at the time we need the information, we're missing the cue we need in order to lead to a full recovery of that information. A key distinguishing feature between this and decay theory is retrieval failure is temporary, because eventually we will get the right cue and we'll be able to retrieve that information. We just need, like I said, the right cue. Decay theory, on the other hand, is a permanent loss of information because the memory trace has faded due to the lack of revisitation of the memory. So these episodic memories that we formed earlier in life, they haven't been revisited, hence the memory is permanently gone. Measures. Recognition versus recall. The reason why we go better on recognition tasks as opposed to recall is because we've got the solution in front of us amongst a series of alternatives. Recall, on the other hand, we don't give any or maybe minimal cues, hence therefore it's more difficult to retrieve the information. Now, in terms of sensitivity, in terms of measures of retention, a sensitive measure of retention can very accurately determine how much information has been retained in LTM. Now, recall is low in sensitivity because we can't accurately gauge how much information you've retained in your LTM. So for instance, if I asked you, tell me everything you remember about your grade 6 graduation, how can I evaluate how much you've actually retained? It's highly subjective in determining how accurate your memory is. Relearning, on the other hand, is a high in sensitivity in terms of measures of retention because we've got a formula. We've got the saving score formula that can very accurately determine how much information you've retained in your long-term memory. And it's the only formula you need to know in the course, T1 minus T2 over T1. So be mindful of this. T could be time or number of trials. So if it was time, we'd look at time of original learning minus time over the relearning divided by your time for original learning. In terms of mnemonics are techniques that we can use to enhance our memory by utilising existing material in long-term memory. Hence they involve elaborative rehearsal. Narrative chaining is where we basically get a list of words to be remembered. We put these words into a bizarre story, and this enhances the manner in which it's organised in our long-term memory. An acronym, we get the first letter of a series of words and we put that into a pronounceable word, whereas acrostics don't form pronounceable words but rather phrases. So we substitute those first letters of the phrase into the actual letters that we need to remember in sequential order. Context. The difference between context and state-dependent cues is context-dependent cues refers to the external environment you're in during the initial encoding and then subsequent retrieval, whereas state-dependent cues refers to the internal environment you're in during the initial encoding and subsequent retrieval process. So in terms of enhancing memory via state-dependent cues, well, when we get a match between the internal environment you're in during the initial encoding with the internal environment you're in during the subsequent retrieval, you're going to get a higher recall. So the internal environment, well, that could be your physiological state, so being drunk, during encoding, you're going to get a higher recall when you're drunk during retrieval or a drug-induced state, or something psychological like your mood, anxiety, sad, etc. Likewise, context-dependent cues, when we get a match between the external environment you're in during the encoding process with the external environment you're in during the retrieval process, you're going to get a higher recall. So we're talking sights, sounds, smells, etc. So taking a witness back to the scene of the crime, that's going to enhance their memory because you're going to get a match with that external environment. Finally, what's the key aspects of eyewitness testimony that we need to know? Well, certainly a key point of emphasis is the reconstructive nature of memory. Memory is not a tape recorder. So what we're doing when we're recalling episodic memories is we literally retrieve the abstract features of the memory that we've stored, and we fill in the missing bits via our episodic buffer from other material that's in our long-term memory in order for that story to make sense. Now, in terms of the second point, what Loftus found is that memory is malleable. It changes when we revisit it. So by reconstructing the memory, we might integrate some false information that might have been implanted via a leading question, viewing mugshots, etc., police lineup, and therefore we'll reconsolidate that memory, potentially containing false memories. I hope this has helped.